Welcome to Implement This with Microsoft Business Solutions MVP Britta Rexstead and co-host Matthew C. Anderson, where we have an insider's discussion around the things we consider when implementing Dynamics 365. In today's episode, sponsored by D365UG/CRMUG, Britta and I discussed goals and goal entities in Dynamics 365. The user group for the Dynamics 365 and CRM community is powered by users for users and specializes in the delivery of member-driven education, networking, and events to help you maximize your current Microsoft Dynamics investment. They're the world's most influential user group community of Microsoft Dynamics 365 and CRM users and partners. Across the globe, members share a common goal of maximizing and advancing the performance of Microsoft Dynamics 365 so that individuals and companies can improve operations, overcome obstacles, and exceed goals. We thank CRMUG for their sponsorship, and now on with the show. And we're back now with another episode of Implement This. Hi, Britta. How are you?
I'm doing great, Matt. How are you?
I am doing quite well. In fact, I'm excited about today's show. Do you know why?
Why?
Because we have a listener question.
Oh, I love those.
Yes, we got an email in from Garry who says, I absolutely love the show. Hey, thanks, Garry.
Thank you, Garry.
And would love if we could talk about a topic here. And this one is specifically around goals and goal management. He thinks this must be the least used, greatest feature.
Oh, I totally agree, Garry. I love goals, and I get in little happy hour fights with people all the time because I still love goals and still think they're totally relevant and underused. And I think people just don't understand them, and so they get a little bit scared off, but they're a great feature. I don't know why they're not used more.
Okay, well, let's spend a little time digging into Dynamics goals and goal management then.
Okay, so first we have to take a little trip down memory lane, and that's when a much younger version of myself learned Dynamics via Richard Knutson's blog, The Dynamics Trick Bag. And I grieve often because it's no longer visible online, and it's kind of like the loss of the library at Alexandria.
Yeah,
careers in Dynamics. It's a huge loss.
I can't tell you how many times I referenced that blog as I was getting familiar with the ropes of Dynamics.
His blogs about workflows hijacked my career. Absolutely. Totally would have a different life right now if it wasn't for this blog. So, in preparing to talk about goals, I was whining a little bit to Matt that the loss of all these wonderful videos that Richard Knutson made about goals, which are all still relevant because goals haven't really changed much since 2011, that I really wish we could share those with people. And they're still on YouTube. Oh my gosh, I'm so excited. It's like Christmas here in the studio. So we are going to throw them all down in the show notes, and you need to do your career a favor. And if you've never watched the greatness that is Richard Knutson talking about goals, you will love them as much as I do by the time you get through these YouTube videos. So
a high bar has been set there for
high
watching
bar,
these
so
videos.
such a high bar. Oh my gosh, he's like my hero. Okay, so we need to talk about goals then.
Yeah, so I mean, if I could start out a little bit, because when I started using Dynamics, I wasn't a consultant or a system administrator. I was part of a sales team and then a sales management team, and we had to use goals. So the question is, why would you want to use the goals and goal metrics entities within Dynamics? And the most simple and straightforward answer is if you want to have a pretty straightforward map of what is a target number that you have, how much have you achieved to that target so far, and in a sales example, what is your existing pipeline that you could close to meet that goal? Goals inside of Dynamics do a really good job of being able to capture that information, associate it to a specific user, and display it in a way that they or their manager can use it. And the other nice thing about the out-of-the-box goals structure in Dynamics is that if you have that manager who needs to roll that up for their team, it takes some of the complexity and potential for double counting the same deal out of it, because it is only counting each deal once, even if it might satisfy two of the people on their team's individual goals.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So when I started with goals, I was in finance back in 2011, and we had an absolutely no code allowed policy. It's like a sign on the front of our clubhouse, no code. And so being in finance, where pretty much all you do is math all day, had to rely pretty heavily on Excel macros and goals, because goals were my only way to roll up data. And so I can appreciate where people say, well, we don't really need goals now. Now we have roll up and calculated fields. And for some of the things I used to hack goals for, that is true. But for what goals are really intended for, calculated and roll up fields don't come close to replacing them. And then the other side of it is now we have gamification, which we've talked about on a previous episode. And that is for specifically kind of training up user habits the way we want them to be. And that is a psychology hack more than a dynamics hack. But gamification you don't do for the data, you do for the user interaction. Goals you do for the data. Goals will actually get you where you need data-wise for reporting and charting. And there's so many things that you need that calculated fields, roll-up fields, and gamification just won't get you. Right. So hang with us. There's probably something in here for you that you do need goals for. And it's actually not that hard to learn. So we and the great Richard Knudsen will walk you through it. Okay.
Sounds good. So should we deconstruct a little bit of the guts of the goals-related entities?
Yes, absolutely. So the first thing to keep in mind with goals is that they only roll up every 24 hours unless you recalculate them manually, and you can't recalculate them in bulk, which is really painful. So as an intern who once upon a time used to have to click through a list to get through all the goals to recalculate, that can be a little bit painful. So just something to keep in mind as you're looking at goals.
Why is it that they don't let you do that in bulk, Britta?
Well, the user, my dumbed down response is the button won't let me. I don't actually know what the technical reason is. Probably something to do with server capacity, but I can only tell you the button won't let me.
Yeah, the button won't let you. In the story I was always told, and this goes back to 2011 days when I was being told this, and it was on premise. So I don't know if it's as relevant in online, but it's because that job happens asynchronously. If you batch a bunch of them up at once, it can cause problems with other workflows that you want to have running throughout the day. So by having the recalculation of those goal roll-ups happening over time, it helps the overall performance of the system and the rest of your workflows moving along, which, if you think about it, for most goals, how much are they really going to move the needle within the span of 24 hours? Probably not enough that you can't just go and hit it manually if you need to, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So let's talk about it at a high level. There's really 3 record types that all come together to make a goal, but they're really 3 unique entities. So we have the goal itself, and that I think of as kind of the protective shell. Everything fits inside of that. So we have a lot of details, and then a goal record might be a parent, so it might have several child records underneath it. Or as Matt was saying, you might use it in a manager scenario where a manager has a quota that's really a roll-up of all of their team's quotas. And we see that. So a goal metric is where we get very, very specific on saying, when I say dollar amount on actual, I mean a one opportunity within that meets these criteria and has this is the field that I care about, and when I'm talking about date, I mean this field. So we get really, really specific on estimated revenue or actual revenue or something else. That's really, really important when you're doing anything custom. So if you have custom fields you're using that have to do with money or time, or really amount or time, goal metrics are that child record, or the integrated record that you're going to use to get that done.
And as we're kind of going through that, I think there's an important thing to keep in mind as you are looking at the way you're structuring your goals. You need to be very precise about which fields are going to be the ones that are rolled up. Sometimes when you're moving into Dynamics, say, you might have 3 very similar fields in a sales scenario, all of them related to the revenue for that deal. Make sure that you think through and you're getting the ones that you need for each of those different states of the goal. I think when I was first implementing this, each sales opportunity had 3 different buckets of revenue. One was hardware, one was software, and one was services, and we were tracking each of those. And salespeople had targets for each one of them. And then there was also the overall opportunity amount. So there was a little more work involved in trying to track, okay, let's get each of these there. And they were each kind of separately tracked in that way as we were setting it up.
This also gives you the opportunity to use different record types. So let's say your Inprogress is a totally different entity than your actual. You have the ability to do that here, which is really nice. You couldn't just easily do that in a view or something else where you can mix those record types. So
and can you be a little more specific with that? Because I know what you're talking about, but I think for some of the people who are maybe not familiar or haven't implemented this yet, they might not quite get that. So what do you mean when you say the in progress versus the actual and tracking that differently?
Great question. So if I have a target, let's say I need to sell $100,000 of a product, and that is my target. I have that data point. I might have an actual data point, and let's say in our sales process, we consider it actual when an opportunity is at a specific point. So I take a specific field for the date and a specific field for the amount off the opportunity, and I'm going to set that up in my goal metric as being the actual value. Okay. So when it's showing on a chart, my target is going to be 100,000, my actual might be 60,000. And then you also have the opportunity for an in-progress value. So if your sales process is actually looking at leads, and maybe you have leads that have to get to a certain point, maybe you are in some kind of a pre-sales, you're stuck in the pipeline. Okay. You could use goal metrics to help you use multiple record types in there.
Got it.
So
okay.
It depends how unique your sales process is, but you have some flexibility there. The other thing to keep in mind is that a goal metric is going to let you decide if you're counting the amount of something in a field or you are counting records. So sometimes, for example, if you're using goals for behavior and you're not using gamification, let's say I've used this before for tracking phone calls. In that case, I'm going to use the count side of goal metrics because I'm just counting how many phone calls they had. Where I find people get tripped up when they're building these is that they say, well, it's not money, it's a number, so I'm going to use count. Yeah. And the thing is, count will only count the number of records that qualify. Right. And so let's say you have another field on there that is numeric, but it's not money. The temptation is to use count. Don't use count. So if you want the number field, whatever kind of number field it is, on the goal to be relevant, or on the record that you're rolling up in the goal to be relevant, use amount. Because you can pick something else. It doesn't have to be money. Yeah. It just kind of feels like they're asking you about money, and that isn't necessarily true. So the next piece where it gets a little bit squirrely, and when I'm doing this in-person training with the PowerPoint, I usually have to pause and really talk about terminology. So sometimes Microsoft gets a little overexcited with using the same word for many things. We find this in lots of places, and this is no different. So the word of the day is Rollup. So within the goal metric, we have Rollup fields. And that's what we've been talking about here, where you're saying, I want the estimated revenue field off of the opportunity. We use Rollup fields within a goal metric to specify, to get to that very exact level, what it is we're counting. Also within goals, we have Rollup queries, and we'll get to that in a minute. These have literally nothing to do with Rollup fields when you're customizing a form. Okay. It has nothing to do with it at all. So the fact that we have Rollup fields inside of goals and Rollup fields in the field designer is a little mean, I think. I'm just going to go out on a limb and say it's really hard to teach it, and I imagine it's even harder to learn.
Though very technically accurate as far as what they're doing,
they are.
Maybe not the most user-friendly in the way to describe it.
Yes, and part of that is that way back when we had roll-up fields and goals, roll-up fields, as we know them today, like calculated fields, those were so far off on the roadmap that they didn't collide at all. So I get it. Just have to have some grace.
And I will say we have, I don't know, half a dozen different things called insights right now.
Oh, I know. Yeah. Access is also another one when you're describing security. That one gets a little tricky. Okay, so let's go talk about roll-up queries, because that's where the magic happens. Roll-up queries are just like advanced find. So if you know how to write advanced find, you know how to write a roll-up query. It's like almost nearly the same designer. It'll feel very intuitive to you. And pretty much anything you can get away with in an advanced find, you can get away with in a roll-up query. So what's really cool about a roll-up query is it lets you get incredibly specific on what records it is you want to include in that goal. So for example, back before we had roll-up fields, when I worked in finance, one thing we had to track was portal logins. So we wanted to see how many times our clients were logging into a portal.
Okay.
And so I needed to have a roll-up of those portal login records. I had that tracking somewhere in my system. And I used Rollup queries to look for the exact account. You can get that specific, or even more picky than that. And so everywhere else on a goal is actually pretty straightforward, where you get really, really specific. So like when Matt was talking about how you might have a quota for hardware and a quota for software and a quota for something else. If you had something really specific, like let's say you had a quota for selling print drivers, you would use a roll-up query to get that specific. If that was your print driver's goal, a roll-up query is how you get there. So those are actually pretty easy to set up. And then all throughout the system, you see this recurring theme of you're always going to have an actual, which is what has already happened and is counted as already happened. You'll usually use some kind of in progress, so what are we working on? And then you'll have a target. And sometimes you can use a custom value. I find I don't use those very often. Usually actual and in progress gets it done for me. But that's kind of the nuts and bolts of it. And we can talk about the nuance a little bit if you want to. Oh, one more hack. Actually, you'll see this when you go watch the Richard Knudsen videos. But my favorite Richard Knudsen hack for goals is that when you need to have a weekly goal, because let's be honest, these things are kind of a pain to set up. And we'll give you some hacks on that when we move into the management side of the conversation. But you don't want to create 1,000 of these because it's a little time consuming. Yeah. So the Richard Knudsen hack for doing it is that you set your time period as like into infinity and beyond. Like you set it for like longer than we're going to have computers. And so you just set it obscenely far out. And then you use your roll-up query to tighten the timeline. So that way, when you're looking at the goal, maybe it's last 7 days or something else. You have some other kind of rhythm or cadence. And so then it's always looking at the last 7 days. So instead of having a goal, making a goal for this week and make a new goal for next week and a new goal for the week after that, you just have one goal that runs forever. And then you use your query. So when you're looking at the result is filtered for you. Love that. That can save so much time.
Never done that, but it sounds like it would definitely be a time saver.
Oh, it's awesome.
Before we get into more hacks, there is something that I'd like to bring up as just another example. I know we've been fairly kind of sales focused in some of these examples here. One place where I saw a creative use of goals that worked quite well was around account planning and strategic account management. Not as much using the revenue side. I mean, the revenue side would happen, but using goals around activity types and activity targets for certain key accounts that an organization was going after.
That's a great idea.
It worked quite well. We were able to find a way to display that information on the account form as well for that roll up to the specific account. So it really helped in being able to organize and structure when you go through that account planning process, how much and what types of activity are we going to drive to be able to improve our relationship over the next quarter, over the next 6 months, over the next year. And then as you assign, who's responsible for that, you can track the progress and then look back at how good of a job did we actually do with this.
That's great.
So not tied to revenue closed or a number of in a call center type of, or a telemarketing situation, number of outbound calls or that kind of thing, but very much trying to structure that. And it was a great fun alternative use of goals.
Yeah, absolutely. And goals are actually really easy to show off. If you want to look smart with your data, start using just a couple goals. The out of the box charts for goals are actually really good. They have nice, easy to read, they're designed really well, and so you can have a chart that shows here's the target, here's where we are today, here's where we're in progress, here's how off we are, and those are really great. And it's actually fairly easy to add that to a form, so then you can have that unique to a customer. And so this is a quick win for an admin without writing any fetch XML or doing anything crazy with charts. You can really show off your data and show how it is actionable, because we want our data to be actionable, and reflecting that same data through a goal in a chart makes it much more actionable for a lot of users.
Yeah.
So we should talk about a couple of the little funny things that we can do a little differently on a goal, because there's some settings that I think throw people off, and then they just throw out goals because they get overwhelmed. So there's a lot of user records, a lot of user lookups on the field, and this is one that usually gets you. People don't learn goals, so they're going to go take an exam, and then they get exasperated with goals because there's so many user lookups, and then they just swear they'll never use goals again, which is a huge loss. So a couple things that you want to talk about. So the goal owner, this is a little bit funny. So the goal owner is the person responsible for meeting the goal. So if we're setting a target for Matt to meet and it's looking at his records, we would make Matt the goal owner. Now, that's different from everywhere else in Dynamics, where the owner is usually the person who updates and kind of babysits the record. That's not the case in goals. Actually, in a lot of cases, you wouldn't necessarily want it to be. Maybe someone, a sales administrator or your boss or someone actually handles these goals, and you, as the person trying to hit the mark, you're not allowed to tinker with your goal. So it's a little different, because that owner word usually means you have rights to edit, and that is not the case necessarily in goals. And then the goal manager is the person who actually, we would usually think of as the owner of a record, who can go in and manage the goal. It's a little bit weird. And then we are also, if you've set up hierarchies, then you can have these roll up in such a way that, if I'm Matt's boss and I have several Matts, they're all rolling up to me, we can set that up here. So that's actually not this manager field at all either. This field does not mean that I am Matt's manager. It just means that I get to edit the goal record. So it gets a little bit squirrely there. Another thing to keep in mind is that if you're going to use the fiscal period, that's the fiscal period you used when you set up your company. So that's over in business settings.
Yep.
So if you've decided when your fiscal year starts and ends and what your quarters look like or what your cadence is, that all happens elsewhere. So when it feels like you're a little tied down here, it's not Microsoft tying you down. It's just you set settings for your whole organization, and naturally your financial metrics need to match the way you do finance.
Yep.
And then the last thing I want to talk about is just a couple things done at the end. You can have it only roll up from child goals and not have its own. That's an option you have down there. And then for the kind of goals, I usually write, when it's asking about if you want the record set to only be that who's owned by the goal owner, which is if you're doing a very specific, this user has to meet this target, let's look at their records. Or all. I usually end up using all in the scenarios I'm in, because usually I'm not using this in a sales scenario. I'm using this in nonprofits, or I'm using it for activities or for something else. So we end up using all. And remember that you can have more fun with it if you need to be creative. Roll-up queries are where all of your creativity is going to happen. So if you need to get a little creative on one of these three people or something else, you want to get a little bit fancy in whose records qualify and whose don't, remember that's a roll-up query that you need.
So one thing, and I know we've discussed this in other episodes, but solution awareness. Do we get it here?
No.
Okay.
Yeah, this is a record. So we set up records in the environment they have to live in. Wah, wah.
Yeah, that's...
Yeah.
I mean, I get it. It is definitely one of those places where, those little hacks to create these, in bulk, or using workflow, or finding those ways to do it. That's part of why those tricks exist.
Yeah, exactly.
Because you can't simply move these from, test into production. And I'd also like to chat a little bit around, who is setting up some of these. Because I'll commonly see, the goal and the goal metric being set up by an administrator, customizer, power user. But then the goals themselves, that's a little more, or the like the individual goals that are owned by people, it's a little more flexible, where it might be the person who's responsible for meeting that target. It might be like a sales admin who does that work. It might be a sales operations team, or I guess, same thing for service ops or, marketing ops, that type of thing. But there's a little more flexibility on that one. So make sure, depending on how you intend to have these goals be created, that you consider the security permissions that people have to be able to create them, but not screw up everybody's goal metrics.
Yeah.
And most people, for an average user, don't want to learn how to set up goal metrics, because it is a little squirrely when you're getting to learn that.
I think you could do a lot of good for your sales admin or for someone else who's setting up if you create really well labeled goal metrics for them. Labeling is key here, and create their roll-up queries if they need them, and give a nice template of what it really usually looks like. Make sure that your fiscal periods are set up right for the organization. No reason why someone else can't follow along, because if that's all set up for them and they just have to pick the right lookup, then they can put in the target and they can measure things the way they want to measure them. So it can definitely be a team approach in how you handle setting these up. If you don't have people willing to help you and you're lazy, like I am, you can use workflows, because that's the solution to everything in my world. So I use workflows, but the kicker is that if you're having so much fun with roll-up queries, you can't make roll-up queries in a workflow. So like that time that I had every single one of our clients had their own goal. It was a very painful season in my life. It's very grateful when roll-up fields came along. But for that, what I would do is I would have a workflow every time a new account, because we used accounts to manage families. Every time a new account was added to the system, it generated the shell of the goal for me, and then it would assign me a task to go in and make the custom roll-up query for that family, and then the goal would work.
Oh, that's creative.
So you can get there. You can get most of the way there, and then you can also do it on imports as well. So that might be a better way to move it between environments. There's still a little bit you have to do, and if you're getting really creative with roll-up queries, then you're just going to have to get really creative with roll-up queries everywhere you need them. But a lot of goals can be done more en masse than it feels like when you're first setting them up.
Okay. Cool. Any final thoughts from you on this before we head off into podcast land?
No. I would love to use goals for something cool and then tweet us about it, because there's so many fun things you can do with goals. And we're going to revive it. We're going to bring back in the most hipster way possible, this vintage Throwback Thursday goals thing, because goals are awesome. I like it. And I would also like to add, thank you, Garry, for listening and for sending in a question. Definitely encourage others out there, if you have a topic that you'd like us to weigh in on in the show, please send it to us. There's information at the end of every episode, but implementthis.org, you can get it to us that way, or find us on Twitter. Thanks, Matt. Thank you, Britta. You've been listening to Implement This with Britta Rexted and Matthew C. Anderson. Do you have a business problem you'd like us to discuss on the show? Reach us through our website, implementthis.org, where you can also subscribe to the podcast. We're on Twitter, too. Britta is at MacGyver CRM, and I'm at MC Anderson. Thanks so much for listening.